All right, well, welcome. Thank you all for joining us in celebration of Dr. White's book, Pain and Paradox in 2 Corinthians, the Transformative Function of Strength and Weakness. A book launch is a very special moment for a college as a testimony to the academic gifts and very hard work of one of its professors. Dr. White earned his PhD from Fordham University and joined the full-time faculty in 2018. He has jumped right into the life of the college, serving as a program chair, as a house advisor already in his time at King's. His book will be the subject of a review panel at the British New Testament Society's annual conference in St. Andrews, Scotland this summer. For today's event, Dr. White will make a few remarks, and then Brent Buterbaugh, Dr. White's FA, will interview him. After, we'll be joined by Dr. Larry Welborn from Fordham University, who is one of the leading experts on early Christianity in ancient Corinth, followed by a time of Q&A. So please join me in congratulating and welcoming Dr. White.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. I see that the pizza brought out many souls, so that's good. I was excited about pizza too. I've got my own stash back there for later. Thanks for being here. Special thanks to Matt for the introduction. Thanks to Larry Welborn from Fordham, you're going to hear from later. He's actually right beside me here. Do we want Larry to be right in front of us the whole time, or should I turn the screen off for a little while? Is that? I'm just thinking for Larry's sake. Otherwise, it's going to be front and center the whole time. But Larry, I'm going to turn off the screen so that you don't have to feel like you're front and center the whole time. If I have to, I don't have the remote. Yeah. So hear from Larry in a little bit, and then we'll have a Q&A session after Larry's remarks, as Matt said. So, anyways, I just want to start by framing the book for you and help you understand why I wrote it, what I was doing, what I was up to, what makes me so interested in this topic, strength and weakness. So why did I write this book? Well, I suppose the answer to the first question there, why did I write this book, it's pretty simple. It's a lightly revised version of my PhD thesis. And so you could say that I wrote this book because I needed to. I was obligated. I wanted a PhD. But that's an oversimplification. It doesn't account for the considerable editing and formatting work that's taken place here at King's to get the work into the form that you see today. A deeper question, though, pushing deeper. I've actually asked myself so many times, why was I interested in this topic? Why did I want to study this for several years of my life and then go through the work of transforming it into a published book, which is not an easy process? Why did I write a book about strength and weakness when I can't claim to have many experiences, major experiences of weakness myself? I'm healthy, so is most of my family. I grew up in a fairly ordinary way. I'm not sure that there are any major traumas in my past, at least not known anyways. So why would I be so interested in an apostle who says, when I'm weak, then I'm strong? I think it all started several years ago, circumstantially at least, when I was wandering the halls of McMaster Divinity College, which is a seminary just outside of Toronto, Ontario. I was in town to do some reading at their library, but before I could find the library, there isn't actually a library in-house, I bumped into a faculty member that I didn't know anyone at this school. His name was Michael Knowles, professor of preaching, who had a background in New Testament studies. He invited me, being a complete stranger, into his office and proceeded to learn all about my plans to do a PhD on the Apostle Paul in England. He had very definite opinions about my research proposal, which was on a completely different topic at the time, and most of his comments stemmed from a book that he had just finished on Paul's theology of preaching in 2 Corinthians. I was fascinated, not only by the passion Michael had for this letter, but also by his countercultural articulations of the letter's content. I was working for a church at the time, and so I started doing some work in the letter. I started preaching from it. I started reading commentary after commentary after commentary. And I was convinced that something was missing. Something wasn't quite right in the way that people read this letter. And so when I arrived at Durham University in Northern England to start my PhD work under John Barclay, I was convinced that I needed to study strength and weakness. It was only after all of this, that whole process of digging and searching and then spending 3 years in England, it was only once the thesis was done, the initial form of the work, that I began to see some underlying personal motivation for the project. When I was in my junior year of college, the exact position that a lot of you are in today or were a year ago or will be in a year or two, I lost a friend in a car accident. His name was David Powell. Dave had stayed over at my place just days before he died. Some of his stuff was still in my living room the day I found out that he was gone. He wasn't much older than me. He was in his early 20s. I had ridden in the car in which he died. I still remember being in that car. When I saw the news reports about the crash, this picture of his smashed up red Honda Civic haunted me. I think Dave's death removed some of my innocence, caused me to ask hard questions about human existence. This world became a dangerous place. People suffer, people die. I wasn't used to that. And why? Why do people suffer? What's the sense of it all? What can we, little creatures that we are, do about it? Better yet, what is God doing when people experience weakness and vulnerability? And is there some way of talking about that which avoids two extremes that are so common in conversation about human suffering? On the one hand, many people act like suffering is nothing. You can try to argue, as some do, that in light of a crucified Messiah, even the New Testament pronounces suffering and weakness to be good. On the other hand, in the face of suffering, you can act like there's no hope. You can see weakness as the worst possible thing. Nothing ever good comes from it. Although I couldn't see it then, Paul's experience of strength in weakness presented the possibility of a middle way, a pathway forward that isn't ignoring suffering, but isn't wallowing in it either. So I proceeded to write this book, and you might be asking, where is it? What does it look like? I'm sorry, I forgot to bring a copy of it. I was on my driveway, I was late for my train, it was there on the kitchen island, and I forgot to bring it. So I'm sorry, I can't wave it for you. Deb offered to print out a picture of it and paste it onto a book, and we could show the cover, but I just didn't think that we should bother. It's a technical and detailed study of 2 Corinthians. So it's not the kind of book that you're going to find in Barnes & Noble. It was published in Moore Ziebeck's Wundt 2 series, which is a well-known destination for publishable PhD theses in my field. Some students at King, some of you, have asked me some really great candid questions about it. Some of you want to know where to buy it. I'd suggest you not do that. It costs $150. But I do appreciate you being interested in the book. Some of you have asked, why is there no picture on the book cover? Why is the cover so plain? Why is the book so expensive? Well, it's the sort of book that's marketed mostly to libraries and to a limited number of academics and grad students. And so there are people who buy it, but they're usually buying it for the purposes of research, because it is, after all, just a modified PhD thesis. Why does the cover not look interesting? Well, in theory, this crowd is usually less swayed by what the book looks like and more interested in its substance. Again, I say in theory. And then it's kind of a gray book cover with blue writing. Again, I would have been showing it to you and pointing out right up there. It's part of a series that spanned decades, and all the books look the same to help researchers identify it on the library shelves. You know, oh, this is a credible Moore Ziebeck volume. I don't have much else to say in terms of framing the remarks. We're going to invite Brent to come up And he's just going to ask me questions about the book, and we'll proceed interview style for a while and just sort of help you to understand the book's content. All right, Brent.
Great. Actually, I'm going to turn off the.
Yeah,
maybe here. Oh yeah. That's right. Yep.
As I said, Brent is my FA, and then he kindly helped me with some of the formatting on the book. So that's one of the reasons why he's up here, is he was doing the indices, he was doing a whole bunch of things, along with Reagan Stanley. I don't know if Reagan is here. That blessed soul, Reagan Stanley, did a lot of painstaking formatting to get it up to the publisher's standards. So thanks to Brent and Reagan and Rachel Williamson, who graduated last year, also helped a bit with that. So.
It's amazing you asked me to do that after all the papers that you've seen from me. So I appreciate that. Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, first and foremost, just thinking through the scholarship that does exist on 2 Corinthians, what do you see that exists within the current academic scholarship on that, and what do you think it was kind of missing?
Right. So most scholars today read 2 Corinthians as Paul's apology for his ministry. It's a defense. And they'll point to something like chapter 10, verse 10, where the Corinthians are influenced by a group of mysterious opponents who are making fun of Paul's appearance. And so they famously say that Paul has weak appearance and speech. So they are straight up and directly telling Paul that he doesn't look so impressive when he's preaching to them, and they prefer to attach their names, in an honor-shame society, they prefer to attach their names to a different itinerant speaker. And so Paul is thought to turn the tables on the Corinthians, instead of like a lot of us who I think would want to deny that we're weak. No, I'm not weak, I'm strong. Paul accepts their criticism. He says, you're right, I am weak, but in my weaknesses, I experience God's strength. And obviously for Paul, that's shaped by the narrative of Jesus' death and resurrection, right? Reality for him is defined by Jesus dying on the cross and then being raised to life again. So he sees that same narrative at work in his own life. So it's really rich for anybody to read. But then scholars tend to focus, Brent, on the apologetic dimension. So they see Paul as still being rather defensive. He's being confrontational. He's sharing about his experiences of strength and weakness. Some scholars would say purely as an apostolic experience. This strength and weakness is not an experience for believers. It's not an experience for those united to Christ. It's only for Paul and for people like him. And the only purpose it's serving is to convince the Corinthians that they should accept Paul as their pastor.
So you've sort of implied some of the next question here, but what does your book provide that the other scholars kind of missed in framing the book?
Right, and so going back to my background, I started preaching 2 Corinthians at a church, and if you ever get into preaching or just saying anything at church really, there are these sort of home run texts. You pick something in the canon, and you're pretty much always going to do well if that's what you're talking about. So classically, a sermon on Psalm 23, no one's going to boo you for that. And 2 Corinthians 12, 9 to 10 would be in a similar sort of vein. Everyone wants to hear about how God's grace is sufficient in our weaknesses. That's a win. And what I found odd is that if that's my hermeneutic, and that's how I'm thinking of Paul, he's a contextual theologian. He's trying to speak to their weaknesses. Why then do we spend so much time reading the letter as though that's not what Paul's doing, and it's just about him, it's just about defending himself? And to be fair, there are reasons for that. If you read the letter, Paul is being really defensive. He is talking a lot about himself. He does have these opponents there. He is trying to get the Corinthians to reaffirm their commitment to him. But I tried to find a way in to see these strength and weakness discourses as being more formative for the Corinthians themselves. I wanted to argue that 2 Corinthians is speaking more deeply and more clearly to the ancient community in Corinth than what scholars were seeing. And so in a nutshell, here's what I did. I noticed that scholars tend to ignore Paul's mention of pain in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and chapter 7. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One is that I think generally academics are shying away from talking about the emotions for various reasons. I'll let you surmise why. And so I wanted to hone in on that and the fact that this pain, which in Greek is the word lupe, was one of the most feared emotions in antiquity. And so building on the work of Larry Welborn, who you'll hear from in just a moment, I argued that when Paul writes to the Corinthians, they have ongoing pains. And if you look at how that word is used in antiquity, it's actually related to the word that Paul uses for weakness. And so you could argue that pain is either related to or is even a type of weakness, according to certain ancient sources. And so that completely changed things. It suggested that the Corinthians aren't just proud rebels, that you need to see Paul as being more comforting. It suggested that his strength and weakness discourses aren't just about him defending himself, it's actually for the Corinthians, in which Paul's presenting himself as a paradigm. In Paul, you can see how God works in weakness. And because we are in Christ, just like Paul is, we can see that in him, God can do the same things in our life. And so it's a study that really tries to rework the way we read 2 Corinthians. It's not an apology. It's a pastoral document that's meant to show the Corinthians the gospel, particularly how Jesus Christ works in the midst of human weakness.
Great, thank you. So you're talking a lot about the pain element of this gospel, but then the title is Pain and Paradox. So I was wondering if you could answer for us, what is a paradox?
What is a paradox? Okay, good question. I'm actually wondering if my mic is used. It is on. You just have an overpowering voice, Brent. Okay, paradox. What is that? Well, it's a great question. So there are literary paradoxes, and then there are theological paradoxes. And so when I say strength and weakness is a paradox, I mean it in both senses. I mean, it's a literary paradox and that it's presented that way. So for instance, in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, Paul hears from the risen Jesus, and Jesus says to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Okay, so it's presented as a paradox because you have two opposed realities or experiences, strength and weakness, but they're said to be true at the same time. It seems like a logical impossibility that's nonetheless true. So that's a basic description of the literary element. But then it's also a broader theological reality. So what I mean by that is that it becomes a true paradox, it becomes truly mysterious, because when Jesus articulates the paradox, he's not just playing word games. He's not just engaging in rhetoric, though it is that. He's trying to say that this is actually the way reality works. For those of you who are in Christ, there's this reality that's seen in Jesus. He finds strength in his weakness. The place of greatest weakness for him was the cross, but it was at the cross that he purchases salvation for the world and is later raised. Likewise, Christ wants to do that in all of our lives. He wants to use your weaknesses to create strength. In fact, any element of true strength in your life is going to have a degree of weakness attached to it. So where I get to, Brent, is in saying that strength and weakness relate to one another in a coherent way. So that's a big term that I use in the book, but what I mean is they qualify one another. So you can never understand your weaknesses apart from the arrival of divine strength. And likewise, the divine strength is finding its natural habitation in the midst of human weakness. So these two things are always together. They're never conflated, they're never isolated. There's strength and there's weakness, and they work together in a sense. That's the beginning of trying to describe it.
That's great, thank you. So I think probably one of the most interesting classes that I took with you was the Christianity in the City class, talking about the letters of Paul and more modern application of those principles. What principles do you see, or do you get into in the book of 2 Corinthians and its application to modern society, modern city, life in New York, that sort of thing?
Yeah, great. There's so many places that I could go. I mean, so like I was saying before, I tend to see that Christians, or just people in general, will press in one direction, to one side of the paradox or the other. So you have tons of people today that want to talk about strength. Think prosperity preachers, Joel Osteen, something like that. Think about business culture and the way there's this mentality that, work hard, party hard, always portray yourself as charismatic, put together. You put up this facade of strength. You're required to do this. On the other hand, you have folks that want to embrace authenticity and vulnerability for the sake of it. right? It's good if I just air my dirty laundry on Facebook, and isn't that so great that I did that? Look at me. And you find that sometimes this can become a really problematic and troubling thing in the Christian church. For instance, I've seen so many occasions where someone in leadership or just a layperson will say that suffering is good. And they'll think that that's what Paul is saying when he says he's strong in weakness. But what the paradox requires you to do is to see that weakness is only good in so much as simultaneously God's strength is arriving in that place of weakness. Paul never says weakness is good, suffering is good. That's where we want you to sit. He says strength in weakness is good. And that's why it's worth developing this conceptual sense of what is a paradox. How do we think paradoxically? Because that makes the difference between basically becoming a theological masochist and saying suffering is good, I love suffering, I want suffering, versus this more finely tuned, nuanced way of thinking, which is what Paul's doing, where he's saying I'm strong in weakness. Weakness is good because God is working in it. And some of the things that come out of this, I talk about it in the book, I would say experiences of strength and weakness, of finding God's strength in the midst of suffering, produces the ability to say love. Think about one of the chief Christian virtues, it's love. And what's the nature of love? It's basically strength and weakness as an ethic. Love requires initiative, it requires commitment, it requires sacrifice, it requires strength. But it also requires weakness. True love will cause you to comport yourself to the other, to respect their desires, to allow yourself to be overruled, right? Love for Paul is one of the outworkings of strength and weakness. And you see that in 2 Corinthians, chapter 12. He has this climactic statement, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And then just a few verses later, he says to the Corinthians, if I love you more, am I to be loved less? And most interpreters completely miss that, but that's the whole point. That's why I say that strength and weakness is transformative. It's not just Paul defending himself. He's trying to show you that if you understand what strength and weakness means, it will fire your entire Christian life. It will fuel a whole bunch of ethics that are really just embodiments of this strength and weakness paradox. I think that's one of them. Love.
I'm not sure how we're doing in time, but I was wondering if you can take us back just a few steps and kind of speak into how we, especially in our modern culture where we are generally relatively comfortable, have things that allow us to feel strong. How do we get to a point where we recognize our own weakness, our own lack of strength, if it's not something that we have like a very specific incident that's making us feel weak? How do we get to that point? Because it's obviously central to the Christian walk.
Yeah. Well, all of us have experiences of weakness and vulnerability built into our lives by virtue of the fact that we're human beings. And so I would say in our world, due to a variety of forces that are dehumanizing, you think of the rise of technology, Zoom, a variety of things that just make us disembodied, it's easy to overlook the fact that we are creatures. We're not gods, we're not demigods, we're not just a brain on a stick, like Rene Descartes would suggest, all right, I think therefore I am. No, you're more than a mind, you're also a body. And that body is subject to nature. That body is subject to decay, to biology, to chemistry. And so I think thinking of ourselves as embodied people is essential to getting in touch with the experiences of weakness that we all have. And they're there, and they're stalking us, and we often want to ignore. And I think actually in the pandemic, that's one of the best examples where all of us have had this sudden experience of mortality and creaturehood by virtue of feeling the threat of illness and death much more closely than we're used to. Great.
How are we doing in time? Are we?
5 minutes, Deb says.
Great.
You know what I want to talk about?
Yeah.
Contemporary implications.
Yes.
Ask me about that.
Yes, contemporary implications.
All right. I'll pay you later. Yeah, so there are a bunch of implications, I think, that stem from the book that aren't discussed there, but I think are implied. And I don't bring them up often, except for maybe in 1 or 2 classes. Some of you will probably start nodding your heads. I think one of them is that if at the center of the Christian life, if for Paul, his understanding of himself his vision of what it looks like to have a good Christian ministry, to know Christ and strength and weakness, I think that has cultural implications. One of them would be that I think the Christian church, particularly in the United States and in other global north countries, needs to become more acquainted with weakness on a broader level, not just a personal level, but an institutional level. I'm doing a study right now, presented at a conference next month, where I'm looking at how the first Christian theologians, they're called the Church Fathers, how they quote Paul's strength and weakness discourses as a statement of their mission to the Roman world. That for them, they think that Jesus goes forward. The world sees their virtue when they're operating in weakness. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but one of them is that it maintains its authenticity. If you look statistically at why people are rejecting Christianity today, it's no longer intellectual arguments. It's all about morality, hypocrisy, the behavior of Christians. And that's because if we on Sunday proclaim that we worship a crucified Lord, but then on Monday we're out there to just make money, lord it over people, abuse others, right? Act like the strong man, people are going to see that, and they are. They see the inauthenticity, they see the hypocrisy, and so I think we need to develop a way of living in the world which is open to being seen as a fool sometimes, is open to being marginalized, right? Especially for those of us that aren't used to that. Accepting some cultural marginalization, I think, will be necessary in a post-Christian world. And I think 2 Corinthians helps us to think about how that could actually be a good thing. Now, good things come from weakness. I also think, Brent, in terms of contemporary implications, the habitus that Christians should embody is one that I would call hopeful realism. If you think about strength and weakness, it's really trying to do two things, which is exactly what the cross and resurrection are doing. It's trying to recognize the reality of death and suffering and to be honest about the human condition. But on the other hand, it's wanting to recognize the hope of the resurrection. And so I think rather than tending towards blind optimism, which doesn't work and people see through it, it's fake, or towards a sort of dour cynicism, which doesn't give the world any hope, a hopeful realism driven by this experience of death and resurrection, I think could be really attractive to people, and again, maintains that authenticity that's at the center of our faith.
That's one final kind of
Yeah.
on that. For those of us who won't probably go on to seminary to read your book and to do academic theology study, can you give us a couple of practical applications as we're thinking about that mindset as we go into our churches, as we go into living life as a believer in any strategic institution? How do we go about doing that?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I would say that you want to embrace a vision of vocation and leadership in which you're seeking to grow and to develop and to be the best you can be. Be ambitious. Remember, this is Paul we're talking about, right? When he writes the letter to the Romans, he says he wants to take the gospel all the way to Spain, which for him is the very edge of the world. So don't let anyone tell you that Christian faith and ambition are opposed. They're not. But at the same time, like Paul, it's good to be open to experiences of failure, to not try to cover those up, to be honest about those and to embrace them and accept them, and not see them as existential detours. And so I would say, don't envision, your emergence into adulthood, your desire to establish yourself in the field. It's not about going from success to success to success. It's about learning from the failures. It's about growing in positions of weakness. And then as you become a full and mature human being, to come alongside people who are having those experiences too, right? To not rise above it all and then be a jerk once you've established yourself, but to actually maintain some empathy and some care for your neighbors, which again is, I think, fulfilling the law of Christ. So, a different vision of leadership and of flourishing that doesn't ignore suffering, it doesn't try to hide weakness, but instead seeks to gain from it and to move on from it in healthy ways.
All right. Thank you.
All right, thank you both very much. So, as Dr. White mentioned, we are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Larry Welborn of Fordham University for some reflections on the work of Dr. White here. Dr. Welborn earned a master's in religion at Yale Divinity School and a PhD from Vanderbilt University. His publications have explored Paul's letters and First Clement, which was written to the church in Corinth, in 4 contexts of Greco-Roman culture: politics, the theater, friendship, and the emotions. His recent book on First Clement is entitled The Young Against the Old, Generational Conflict in First Clement. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Welborn.
Thank you. I am honored and in fact delighted to be with you on this occasion. And I only wish I could have been there in person to celebrate this wonderful book written by your teacher and colleague, Dr. Benjamin White. I had the opportunity to meet Ben for the first time at a Society of Biblical Literature meeting some years ago when he was still researching and writing his dissertation. And of course, I was thrilled to discover a young scholar who shared many of my interests, not only in 2 Corinthians, but also in the 2 subjects that are mentioned in the title of Ben's book, Pain and Paradox. But when I met Ben, it was immediately clear to me that he was a creative person, courageous, willing to rethink issues, that he was deeply sincere and a very gracious person. And I'm sure that's how you have come to know him at the King's College. He was also very smart in choosing to pursue his doctoral research under the mentorship of Professor John Barclay, who is one of the most generative and distinguished New Testament scholars in the world. The courage and creativity of Dr. White was, first of all, made clear in his choice of 2 Corinthians as the subject of his dissertation. 2 Corinthians is widely acknowledged to be the most complex and difficult letter of Paul. A number of New Testament scholars believe that 2 Corinthians is actually a collection of 5 letters written by Paul to Corinth over a period of years. Other scholars find that the letter hangs together and can be read as a unified text. In focusing on what was missing from the scholarship, as Dr. White began to preach on this, absolutely right to identify that there was a missing component. The scholars who analyze 2 Corinthians into a collection of 5 letters, they refer to the letter in which Paul's discussion of pain takes place. Dr. White referred to 2 Corinthians chapters 2 and 7. And those are Paul's most explicit references to pain. Going back to the work of a German scholar named Günther Bornkamm, that section of 2 Corinthians has been denominated in German Der Versöhnungsbrief, which is translated into English, the letter of reconciliation. That designation became well established in scholarship, and it created among scholars the impression that all was now well between Paul and the Corinthians, when he wrote this letter. And all he had to do was set the seal of reconciliation upon the relationship. To be sure, there was a recognition that Paul was still defending himself, that he was still assuring the Corinthians of the sincerity of his conduct and also the integrity of his apostolic ministry. But what Dr. White recognized is that woven through the fabric of the writing that we call 2 Corinthians is a therapeutic practice by Paul. Paul has much work to do to heal the wounds that had been opened by the conflict between Paul and the ecclesia of Christ believers in Corinth. Dr. White rightly focused upon the Greek word lupe, which we translate pain. But what's important for you all to know, and what Dr. White recognized, is that in Greek, no clear distinction was made between physical pain and emotional pain. The word lupe covers both physical pain and emotional pain. And the same is true for the Latin word aegritudo. Now, among Paul's contemporaries, a great deal of attention was devoted to the role of pain in the life of a wise person. The dominant philosophy in the time of Paul was Stoicism. This outlook on life, that a person should endeavor to achieve self-mastery. And in order to do that, the Stoic sage tried to make himself invulnerable to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, as Shakespeare said. How do you do that? You do that by turning away from pain. You abolish it. You remove it as far as you can from your life. In fact, among Paul's Stoic contemporaries, there was no positive or constructive emotion instead of pain. Pain could not be transmuted. It could only be abolished and removed. And what Dr. White realized is that because of Paul's belief in a Messiah who had died in weakness, who suffered crucifixion, the most humiliating death in the ancient world, a death inflicted upon slaves. And yet, this person who suffered a slave's death was declared by the resurrection to be the Messiah, the Son of God. So Dr. White recognized that Paul's crucial breakthrough was to recognize that pain, even the pain of the cross, even the deepest emotional wounds, that they don't have to be abolished from life. In 2 Corinthians 7, Paul argues that the Christ event had partitioned pain. To be sure, there is still a pain that is according to this world, and that But Paul was able to assert, because of his belief in the crucified Messiah, Paul was able to assert that there is another kind of pain. There is a pain that leads through the transformation of a person's heart and mind. And that pain ultimately leads to health, broadly conceived. So we don't have to run away from those moments when we experience pain and weakness. In fact, Paul encourages the Corinthians, and he still encourages us, to live on emotional surplus, to live on the overflow of our emotions. And Paul puts forward a concept of Christian community as a place where we share with one another in our sorrows as well as our joys. That is possible because of what Jesus shared of our pain, our sorrows, and our joys. Well, in his book, Dr. White extended Paul's deepest insights beyond the so-called letter of reconciliation. Dr. White argued that Paul's paradoxical conception of Christian existence as strength discovered in weakness, and ultimately, as Paul argues, in 2 Corinthians 4 and 5, the most extreme form of the paradox of Christian existence is life made manifest in death. Now, what does Paul mean by this? He finally explains it in 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, "The love of Christ holds us fast. It constrains us. It has a grip on us." When we hear the message that there was one who loved so much that he gave his life for others, and this love holds us fast, and as we are in its grip, what we recognize is that one died for all. And in that moment, some part of us begins to die. We share in the Messiah's sacrifice. Now, what part of it, what part of ourselves begins to die? Paul says it is the self-seeking part, the part that seeks one's own advantage. Paul says one died for all, and in that, all died, so that those who live might live no longer for themselves. Christian existence is thereby characterized by Paul as existence for another. Now, as Ben White recognized, this is profoundly countercultural. In contemporary America, we justify everything by appealing to self-interest. That's true in economic life, it's true in political life. But what Paul discovered, the deepest paradox, is that it is possible to break out of the prison house of the ego and to begin living for another. How do we do that? Paul says, because God has begun creation over again. Those who have been grasped by the message of Jesus' death for others, they are liberated from the prison house of the ego They are a new creation, and they are given by God a ministry of other making and other becoming, because God was in Christ making the world other to God's self, no longer counting our mistakes against us. Now, more successfully than any previous study of the topic of the Pauline paradox, Benjamin White's book demonstrates that paradox characterizes the whole of the complex writing that we call 2 Corinthians. The deep understanding of the meaning of a Messiah who was crucified in weakness. And so I think Benjamin White's book has a great future. It has a future not only among scholars who wrestle with the proper understanding of 2 Corinthians, but I think it also has a future for the way that Christians relate to and try to deal with their emotions. If Dr. White is correct, we ought not to be afraid of those moments of pain and weakness in our lives, because Jesus has already been through those moments, and therefore we can go to that place. So many of the problems in our world today are ultimately psychological problems. This is true of so many of the crimes that stalk the streets of our beloved New York City. And it's true on an international scale. The anger and the deep woundedness that drives violence and aggression in relations between countries. So a deeper understanding of Paul's paradoxical insight into the emotions ought to be on the agenda for all of us. And what that requires of us is that we ought not to be reluctant to embrace the paradox of wisdom in foolishness, strength in weakness. Let me close with an anecdote. Been one of the scholars who influenced me the most, Dieter Georgi, the great scholar of the New Testament who taught for a long time at Harvard and then went back to Frankfurt and finished his career there. He adopted me into the circle of his students. And so for several years, he brought me to Frankfurt to join in the colloquia that he hosted on the subject of teaching the Bible for social change. On the last occasion, when I met with Professor Georgi, he had just recently read my little book, Paul, the Fool of Christ. And he challenged me. He said, Larry, you have written about Paul as the fool of Christ and the foolishness and weakness of the gospel. But then Professor Georgi said, Larry, you have not yet become a fool for the sake of Christ. I think those were probably the last words that he spoke with me, and they haunt me to this day. So I think that has to be part of the paradox that we embrace as followers of the crucified Messiah today. Thank you, all of you at the King's College, and especially Dr. White, for this opportunity to read the final product of Dr. White's dissertation research and to reflect with you for a little while today.
Dr. Welborn, thanks so much for your kind comments. I didn't know about that, about Dieter Gorgi, actually, so that's interesting to hear. I think now everybody can tell why I asked Dr. Welborn to speak. He's such a knowledgeable, articulate communicator and scholar on Corinthians. And what you're saying there, Larry, actually is maybe want to come up to Fordham so we can have lunch sometime.
Yes.
Pick your brain again.
Absolutely. I'm even more eager to do that now that I've been able to read the whole book.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Good to see you.
Thank you.
I think we now have time for some questions. So if you have questions for me about the book, really anything, just content or just the background to it, we've got at least 5 minutes or more.
I'm curious about where your career might go in the future. Are you thinking about digging in on Corinthians 1st and 2nd for the foreseeable future, or are you going to make it more of a broad New Testament? I'm just curious, what topics are you interested in pursuing?
Yeah,
maybe it's
thanks.
too early to say that. But.
No, I've got a plan. So I've always got a plan. It's actually one of my, it's a strength and a weakness, I guess we should say. So I'm wanting to write a popular level book that broadens out Paul's strength and weakness stuff and turns it into a political philosophy. So I've been reading a lot about politics, liberalism, the post-Christian worlds, and I'm slowly chipping away at that. But then I'm also trying to move in academic circles more towards Pauline theology. So studying 2 Corinthians, which as Larry noted so well, is seen as complicated and complex, and a lot of people don't want to deal with it. With Paul, they focus more on Romans and Galatians for various reasons. It's helped me to see a different side of Paul than the one that's often presented in academic circles and even in the church. And so that's gotten me interested in how we conceptualize Paul as a whole, how we think about his letters, the scope of his thought, and particularly how we contextualize today and how he contextualized then. So my course here at King's, Christianity in the City, really kind of plays with some of those ideas, seeing Paul as a contextualizing thinker and as potentially a model for how Christians can re-engage with the post-Christian world. So I don't think I'm sticking in strength and weakness. I'd be quite happy to move on, but it's naturally, like most PhD theses, it's always going to be shaping what I'm doing from here.
Hey, Dr. White.
Hey, Brendan.
I just wanted to ask what you believe informs Paul's perspective on pain, considering not only that he's experienced great pain, but that he also inflicted great pain, and the resurrection, his background in philosophy. Just what are your thoughts on his perspective?
Yeah, great question. So in 2 Corinthians itself, he says that he has pained the Corinthians with one of his letters. And there's some debate about which letter it is. Is he referring back to 1 Corinthians? Is he referring to a letter that we don't have? Or is he referring to something that was actually stitched onto 2 Corinthians? There's debate about this. I think it's a letter we don't have. So he's written a letter that maybe, and again, there are a bunch of theories on this, but maybe it came on a little too strong, we could say. And so it has the unintended consequence of hurting the Corinthians. He realizes, oh, they're not as strong as I thought they were. They're not able to handle this the way that I expected. So I think it flows out of that, as it often does, Brandon. For Paul, yes, his main source of theology is Israel's scriptures, but experience also sometimes plays a big role in how he does his theology as well. And that's something I think that American Christianity doesn't always want to recognize, is that for Paul, experience is a major category. And then I think beyond that, it's getting back to what Dr. Welborn talked about. I think Paul has some similarities to the Stoics. Having grown up in Tarsus, we could surmise that maybe he would have been somewhat familiar with Stoic philosophy. I mean, he certainly seems to by the time he produces a lot of his letters. And so they had this tendency, as Dr. Welborn was saying, to want to turn away from pain and to avoid it. And actually, as far as lupe goes, the specific pain he talks about in Corinthians, the Stoics had no solution for it. They didn't know what to do with it. they thought it was irredeemable. And so it seems like there's something about the crucified Christ and his resurrection that just completely changes how Paul perceives reality. I can't say it any other way than that, to say that Paul thinks the crucifixion and resurrection really, really matter in a way that goes beyond the way that we're used to thinking. It just changes how he views everything. And I think that would include pain. Yeah, other questions or comments? All right, well, oh, yes.
So we emphasized the nuance of the strength through the weakness and not just harping on the weakness itself. Practically, how do you toe that line of like, okay, I'm weak right now. Is God working through that? Where is his strength? And when do I need to step away from that weakness or work to get out of it and move into my own strength, if that's even a thing?
Yeah. So there are three basic models that people work through on 2 Corinthians, and they all yield slightly different takes. And I have my own take that I articulate in the book. So some people would say you have to lean into your weakness. You have to really feel it, and the more you feel it, the more God's power will come upon you. So it's almost like really contrarian thinking. You know, the weaker I get, the more I almost punish myself, the more God's power is going to show up. So that would mean leaning into the weakness, and then almost supernaturally the power comes. Another viewpoint would say that you're weak, and the way to find strength would be that you have to see yourself from a different perspective, from a heavenly perspective. You might appear weak to a human being, but actually inside, in your heart of faith, whatever, you're strong. My view on this is sort of a combination of both. So I think it is to some degree about managing your perspective and living out of a particular narrative, right? We're always telling ourselves narratives about our weakness, about our suffering. This happened to me because I did this. This happened to me because God dislikes me. This happened to me because I deserve it. And you'll notice a lot of philosophies and worldviews and religions will tell you exactly that, right? They'll spin a narrative about suffering. And the key thing is to hone in on the early Christian narrative about suffering, which is to say that suffering isn't necessarily a sign. It doesn't need to be spiritualized or given a narrative. It's just something that happens because you're a creature, and it's inevitable. It's inevitable. It's just going to happen. It's going to be ongoing. So you shouldn't be surprised by it. That's the realism. But then the hope is to say that in the midst of that, I'm going to look for little places where this suffering is being used in the moment, right? Not just after the fact, retrospectively, but in the moment, it's going to form you in ways that help you in your life of virtue. And so I think it involves thinking about what that is. You know, don't be unrealistic. Suffering is not going to make you feel good. It might not make you feel happy. It might eventually destroy you. All of our lives end in suffering. But not in the ultimate sense for those who are in Christ, right? It ends in suffering initially, but then it results in resurrection. And more than that, you can see little tastes, little foretastes of the resurrection in your life. You know, those moments where you realize that a bad experience caused you to grow in humility, and that was necessary for you to grow as a person. Or that, you know, this loss enabled you to learn how to empathize with somebody who has that loss too, but you were never able to understand it until you experienced it yourself. And so I think it's about holding on to all these intangible ways in which somehow, almost mysteriously, suffering helps us to be more of who we were meant to be. And that almost oddly, you know, I can look back at my own life. If we didn't have suffering, you have to ask, well, what person would I be now, right? And would I actually be better? I'm not sure. But yes, you're right. Walking a fine line is a very fine line. Yeah. You gotta watch how you talk about it. Other questions? Comments? All right, well, I think we're at time. Thanks so much for coming. It's really great to see you.